Continuing. 8th grade. For my last year at Holy Ghost, my homeroom teacher was Mrs. Whedon. She was tall with curly hair and a big personality. She was friendly and helpful as opposed to so many nuns. She had our creative writing class to teach, and there she brought out the writer in me. We would have creative writing class once or twice a week, during which we would have to write a story or an article of some kind. At that point, I thoroughly enjoyed writing. Mrs. Whedon made it more fun by drawing attention to me for my writing. We'd all sit down and start writing, and immediately I saw that some kids had no idea what or how to write. They were stumped while I was churning away at stories as fast as my hand could write. Then, after about 20 minutes, Mrs. Whedon would look at me and ask if I was almost done. I'd say yes, but there's more, and she'd always ask to see what I had done so far. She'd read it, and within a few seconds of reading, she'd smile and stop the class so they could pay attention to her reading my writing. This began with the very first creative writing class we had, and continued for most of the rest of the year. It was the first thing I was better at than anyone in my class. It was the first thing that got me positive attention from my peers. Later on, I realized that I wasted a lot of time not having creative writing classes in these years previous to that. I had to wait until my last year there, and that's just wrong. We were asked to write about a lot of things, using lots of different aims and purposes, and I ended up letting out some of my skepticism in my writing. One article was about alcoholism, and I wrote it myself, but just thinking about addiction led me to think critically about religion. I also wrote about war, which had the same effect on my thinking. All negative roads lead to religion, I realized. But that was only half of the harm that religion did. The other half was the negative roads leading from religion. In addition to doing a lot more writing in 8th grade, we also did a lot more reading. Some of our required reading included Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain, Animal Farm by George Orwell, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I was very impressed with all of these 3 books, but we were never told that these 3 authors were all very critical of religion. Mark Twain even wrote his own version of the Holy Bible to show how insane the Holy Bible is. We weren't told about these attitudes in the minds of famous people we were learning about. It's the same for most of our best atheistic heroes and heroines in history. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Margaret Sanger, Matilda Jocelyn Gage were all deeply critical of Christianity and showed that intellectual strength can have strong social effects. We simply weren't educated on their attitudes toward religion, and not in public school either. So I had to find that out much later, when I got active with atheism. I'm glad so many atheists have worked so hard to preserve information about our atheist heritage. As 8th graders, we were given more freedom of movement during the school day than the rest of the grades. So we took liberties. One day, a few buddies and I went into the church uninvited. No one else was there. Our devious instincts took over, and we all went straight to the altar boys' sacristy. That's the little room behind the altar, out of view, where church supplies and robes are kept. The altar boys had a lot to do, and their robes were in tall cabinets that lined the walls of the inside of the sacristy. In other matching cabinets along the walls were the celebrants' robes. The celebrant is the priest who runs the Mass. The other items, like candles, Bibles, wine, water, and hosts, were kept in a large walk-in safe. It was much more like a bank vault. As soon as you turn right past the altar area into the altar boys' sacristy, you'll see the vault on your left. It's as tall as every other wall in that room. We all went to that room and looked around for something to do. It was my first time being back there without a priest present. I never got a look at the vault up close until then. This time it intrigued me. It beckoned me. It had a dial combination lock, so I thought I'd play around and pretend to be a safecracker. I dialed and laughed it up. Then after a few seconds of dialing, I stopped and grabbed the handle and pushed down, and it opened. It opened right up, easily. How did that happen? Was it really closed in the first place? Yes, I remember. I couldn't open it until I played with the dial. Did I crack that wall safe? Life is fun. The surprise of opening that vault was quickly reinforced by the glee we felt when we saw what was inside. Among those things were at least a dozen bottles of wine for the masses. It was apple wine. We never knew what kind of wine it was until we saw it in the original bottle. It was white apple wine. There were also a few large bags of hosts. One bag probably held 1,000 hosts. We had never seen so many in one place. And in a clear plastic bag? That's not the kind of reverent container we usually see them in. It almost seemed like sacrilege to keep them in a plastic container of any kind. Of course, I remember that those were unconsecrated hosts. Okay. I don't remember seeing any water, though. Water was used in the same amount as wine during Masses. It occurred to me later on that the water was probably all obtained from a normal faucet. Again, this blew my mind the first time I realized it. Water is water until it's blessed by a priest, and then it becomes holy water. We had a mental image of special water in our minds. We were convinced that holy water was special and had magical powers. Those powers weren't for us students, though, or most people, really, apart from the water in the little metal cups on both sides of each church entrance. As you walk into Catholic Church, you're supposed to dip your fingers in the holy water by the door, and then do the sign of the cross with your fingers, another bizarre but relatively minor ritual. There were also the gold candlesticks we would see decorating the altar area during Masses, and extra gold chalices and glass pitchers for water and wine. We saw a variety of gold and jewel-encrusted items. The first thing we went for was the wine. We quickly opened up a bottle and drank as fast as we could. Suddenly there was a feeling of urgency to our actions. It tasted pretty good, much better when you get a whole mouthful instead of just a sip. We were being teased at every liturgy we went to by getting only a tiny sip each. Now this was living. As we guzzled wine, we opened one of the large bags of hosts and began to eat hosts by the handful. We weren't hungry. I think it was just after lunch that we did this. We were just anxious to misbehave somehow. It was that reputation thing again. So we hurriedly stuffed our mouths with hosts and wine, and then quickly got out of there. We left the vault wide open, with a bit of a mess inside. I remember getting a tremendous charge out of it, every step of the way. It was like a release and a risk at the same time. It felt very right. When recess was over, we went back to class, and I didn't think much about it. The next day, it was announced that some of the students in our grade were going to have one-on-one interviews with Brother Clement. The reason was not given. Over the next few school days, our whole grade got to have a little talk with Brother Clement, one at a time. When my turn came, I honestly forgot about our church antics. I was asked to go into the altar boys' sacristy, and then beyond, a couple of offices, to a conference room. I'd never been that far into the building before. The altar boys had a larger room with more robes and supplies. It was an eerie, lonely-feeling room. Brother Clement sat at the table across from me. He began to ask a series of irrelevant questions, like, how's your family life going? Are you and your sister getting along? Do you feel healthy? He never got around to the incident and never came close to getting that specific about the purpose for the interview. After our entire grade went through that process, the whole matter was dropped as far as we students could tell, so we didn't mention the questioning either. I felt then, and still feel today, that those people and that church owe me. I spent so much time at that church, so much more than any individual parishioner who wasn't a student or faculty member, that I felt like I owned a part of that church building. I grew up there. I paid my spiritual dues towards salvation there. I got sick there, too. I don't know how many times I sat through Masses or the various kinds we attended over the years, but I know it's a big number. Hundreds of regular Masses, twice a week minimum. The week also usually included a mini-Mass, the Liturgy of the Eucharist, on a Wednesday or Thursday during school. That we had in the liturgy room, next to the faculty 8th grade library. At those liturgies, we had no pews. We sat on carpet sample mats. It was long and painful, on the floor for almost an hour. As kids, we fidgeted like we were normal, and the adults in the room had us captive to the ceremony. They preached and read from the Bible and then did the Eucharist. It was the condensed version of the Mass, and in a much smaller room.
When it came time for communion, this was the only kind of Mass in which we students would each get some wine. We'd get a sip, all from the same chalice. They'd wipe it off with a nice clean white towel that's more for show than anything else. I didn't realize that at the time, but all of us kids sharing one cup like that with our various colds, well, that's nasty. It's more of the physical nature of Catholicism. So we had to sit through a lot of regular Masses and preaching sessions during the school week. This was in addition to having to go to the same church on Sunday with our families. The children of the parish attended more Masses than the adults by a factor of 3 to 1, roughly. I felt like it was a lot of overload, but that it was perfectly normal. I had not known any other way to attend school. This was also in addition to 1 hour a day of religion class in which we seldom learned about anything outside of Christianity. By around 7th grade, I had attended so many Masses that I began to have a serious problem with them. I would get nauseous about halfway through the hour-long service. I would get dizzy, I'd get a headache, and mostly I'd need to throw up. That would happen mostly during the Mass we attended during school, all packed in there like sardines. When I went with my parents on Sundays to church, there was a lot less pressure. I could easily get up and go outside if I wanted to. My parents tried to get me to stay, but after a few years of having to deal with nuns in the same room over the same problem, my parents began to lose their challenge. It bothered me a lot in 7th grade, but then I came back from summer into 8th grade, and it got much worse. It got to where I couldn't complete a Mass. About halfway through the Mass, I'd have to leave. During school, I would have to haggle with Sister Angelina about it. She always tried to get me to stay. She'd go through steps. Step 1, put your head down and you'll feel better in a minute. So I leaned over while I sat in the pew, and this had 2 negative effects. First, it made me feel worse, physically. It seemed obvious that this was the way to throw up, not how to avoid throwing up. Second, it made me feel worse mentally, because I now looked like a total fool in front of my whole class and any other classes whose eyes were wandering. After about a minute of doing that, I would tell Sister Angelina that I now feel worse, so she'd finally say, okay, go to the clinic. Yes, thank you, sweet relief. Anything to get out of that oven of madness, I thought. The very second I walked out of that church doorway and into the bright sunshine and outdoors, I felt 1,000% better. I enjoyed the walk to the clinic and took my time getting there. It wasn't a long walk, so I enjoyed myself on the way. I walked into the clinic and sat down and told the nurse what happened. She told me to lie down on the couch while she took my temperature. She never found anything wrong with me and just let me lie there for a while until Mass let out. Then I went back to class. I did this probably 10 times over the course of my 8th grade year. Sometimes I would just go to the gym or back to my class. I don't know exactly how many times I had to leave Masses, but I remember it was dozens in total. It got to a point where I couldn't sit through a Mass, and I still had half a year to go at that school. The same thing happened when I attended with my parents, and eventually they gave up on trying to keep me inside. I would just go hang out on the steps of the church. All I knew is that if I stayed in that church 1 minute longer, the janitor would have to be called with the sawdust. I only knew of one other student or churchgoer of any kind that had the same problem. It only happened in front of me once, too. We had a late registering student named Cindy or something, and I never really got to know her. Well, during one of our last Masses of the 8th grade year, she asked to leave about halfway through, just before I was going to leave. Before I even got sick, she was leaving, and I was impressed, so I watched her leave. As she approached the main entrance doors, she fell almost to the floor and had to be carried by 2 other students out of the church and into the clinic. I remember feeling exonerated a bit after seeing that.